My name is Caleb Mercer, and before everything fell apart, I was a diesel mechanic in Bemidji, Minnesota. I was 36 years old, divorced, living alone, and the kind of man who trusted a socket set more than most people. I worked on logging trucks, farm equipment, pickup trucks, and whatever else got hauled into the shop with a problem nobody else wanted to chase down. My boss liked me because I showed up early, did not talk too much, and did not guess when I did not know something. Customers liked me because if I told them a machine would run, it ran. If I told them it was done for, it was done for. That was my life before the outbreak. Steady work, cold winters, long drives, a rented house with a detached garage. Nothing dramatic. The cabin is the reason I am still alive. It belonged to my Uncle Wayne, my mother's older brother, a retired Minnesota Department of Natural Resources officer who spent most of his adult life around forests, lakes, poachers, snowmobiles, and bad weather. He built that hunting cabin with two friends in the late 1990s on a small piece of private land northeast of Blackduck, out past where the pavement gives up and the roads turn to gravel and then to dirt. It was not large. It was not luxurious. It was not hidden in a fantasy story way either. It was just far enough from town, far enough from convenience, and far enough from casual traffic that almost nobody went near it unless they had a reason. That is what made it useful. The place sat at the edge of a mixed stand of aspen, birch, balsam fir, and jack pine, with low, wet ground to the east and a shallow ridge to the west. There was an old logging trail that led in from County Road 39 and then forked near a stand of dead spruce. One branch ran to the cabin. The other branch had not been maintained in years and disappeared into brush, wind-thrown trees, and boggy ground. In deer season, Wayne would go up there for a week at a time with his old Marlin lever action rifle in .30-30 Winchester, a 12-gauge pump shotgun, and enough canned food to ignore the world. In winter, the cabin was reachable by snowmobile if the drifts were not too bad. In summer, a half-ton pickup could make it if the driver knew where the washed-out ruts were. I had been going there since I was 12. That mattered. Most people who imagine surviving somewhere remote think the place itself saves them. It does not. What saves you is familiarity. I knew every weak door hinge, every warped floorboard, every spot where rainwater dripped hard in spring, every place mice liked to nest, every place squirrels tried to chew in, every stump along the trail that could tear a sidewall if you cut too close in the dark. I knew where the hand pump well stood, 30 yards behind the cabin, where the old propane tank line ran, where Wayne had buried a spare 5-gallon gas can under a steel tub to keep the weather off it, and where he kept a backup key inside an old tobacco tin nailed under the porch beam. I had helped reshingle the roof when I was 19. I had replaced one of the cabin windows with Wayne after some storm-thrown branch cracked it. I had even rebuilt the wood stovepipe collar with furnace cement one October because cold air was leaking in around the flashing. That cabin was not a miracle. It was just a place I understood. The first signs that something was wrong did not feel like the start of the end. They felt like the kind of bad news cycle you stop listening to because the television never runs out of crises. There were reports from the East Coast first, then from major cities farther inland. People acting irrationally, unusual attacks, emergency rooms over capacity, local governments advising residents to remain indoors in certain districts while authorities investigated a fast-moving public safety incident. Those were the words they used. Public safety incident. It sounded temporary, like a riot, like some contaminated drug batch, like a disease cluster. Nobody around me used the word zombie at first unless they were joking. At the shop, we listened to AM radio while we worked, and the tone changed over 3 days. On day 1, it was confusion. On day 2, it was urgency. On day 3, a state official came on with the kind of tight, controlled voice that tells you everything is worse than he is allowed to say. He said there had been multiple violent incidents in the Twin Cities, hospital staffing shortages, interruptions to highway traffic, and requests for National Guard support in several counties. He said people should remain calm. He said not to travel unless necessary. He said to avoid contact with aggressive individuals displaying signs of severe neurological distress. Nobody says severe neurological distress unless they are trying very hard not to say something else. That same afternoon, a customer named Eric brought in a 3/4-ton Ford with front-end damage from a ditch strike on Highway 71. He was a heavy equipment operator, late 40s, usually hard to rattle. He looked like he had not slept. While I checked the bent steering linkage, he stood with his arms folded and told me he had driven past a gas station south of Bemidji, where 2 squad cars were parked sideways across the lot, doors open, nobody in them, while half a dozen people wandered around bumping into pumps and parked vehicles like they were drunk or concussed. He said one of them walked directly into the hood of his truck when he slowed down. Not stumbled, walked. Face first, like he did not feel it. Eric punched the man in the chest to get him off the grill, and the man kept trying to grab at him. I asked if the man was on something. Eric said, "Maybe. Or maybe none of us know what this is yet." By that evening, store shelves in town had started to thin out. Not empty, not yet, but you could feel the mood shift. People moved faster. They bought more than usual. Canned food, bottled water, batteries, propane cylinders, bleach, dog food, toilet paper, over-the-counter pain medicine. Every checkout lane had a line. People were watching each other. You could feel the suspicion in the air. Nobody wanted to be the last person who had underestimated the situation. I bought what I could without turning it into a scene. 2 cases of bottled water, though I knew I had better options if I made it to the cabin. A 50-pound sack of rice, dry beans, oatmeal, salt, cooking oil, canned soup, canned chicken, tuna, crackers, coffee, boxed milk, matches, 2 extra fuel filters for my truck, engine oil, transmission fluid, a chainsaw bar and chain kit, mixed gas oil, a full box of 12-gauge shells, not because I expected to fight my way through anything dramatic, but because in rural Minnesota a shotgun is as normal as a shovel, and because a firearm that works is one less thing to worry about. I already owned a 12-gauge Remington 870 pump, a Ruger .22 rifle, and a Glock 19 pistol that I kept locked in a steel box in my bedroom closet. Legal, registered where required, clean, maintained, and boringly ordinary. On the drive home, traffic was heavier than it should have been for a weekday evening. Not a gridlock, just too many people moving at once, too quickly in the wrong direction. Southbound lanes looked worse. A lot of packed vehicles. A horse trailer. A utility trailer stacked with plastic totes and bicycles. A minivan with blankets taped over the rear side windows. At one stoplight near a pharmacy, I watched a man in hospital scrubs sprint across the street and pound on the locked front door of a liquor store while cars leaned on their horns around him. Nobody got out to help him. He did not look injured. he looked terrified. That night, I called my mother in Brainerd. She told me to come there if things got worse. I asked if she had enough food and water. She said yes, but her voice was unsteady. She had been watching cable news all day and could hear sirens outside her apartment on and off since noon. I told her to fill the bathtub, charge her phone, keep her doors locked, and stay away from anyone acting strange, no matter who they were. I told her not to let neighbors in if there was any doubt. That was the kind of advice that would have sounded cold a week earlier. That night, it sounded practical. I barely slept. Sometime after 3 a.m, a helicopter went over low enough to shake my bedroom window. At 5:30, I was up, dressed, and standing in the kitchen with a mug of coffee I did not want. I switched on the television. Every channel was either breaking news or old programming. The governor had issued a statewide emergency declaration. Schools closed. Some counties were under movement restrictions. The crawl at the bottom of the screen mentioned attacks in St. Cloud, Duluth, Rochester, and several smaller towns. Cell service was unstable in some areas. Hospitals were requesting only critical cases. Law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed. There was shaky phone video from somewhere downtown. People running. A person slamming into the side of a stopped car hard enough to bounce off and then getting back up. Smoke in the background. Nobody on camera understood what they were seeing, so they filled the gap with panic. At 6:15, the local radio station stopped taking normal calls. At 6:40, my boss texted everybody and said, "Do not come in." At 7:02, my neighbor Carl banged on my front door with both fists. When I opened it, he was breathing hard and holding a baseball bat like he expected trouble to be standing behind me. "They shut the clinic," he said. "My brother called from Grand Rapids. He says people are attacking each other on the highway. They aren't stopping from getting hit. He says one got shot and still kept moving." That was the first time anyone near me said it plainly. Not dramatic, not joking. Just reporting the fact that normal rules were not applying anymore. I looked past him and saw 2 houses down. Another neighbor loading black trash bags into the back of an SUV with the engine running. Somebody else was trying to back a travel trailer through a turn too tight for the street. Everybody had the same expression. Late realization. I did not make some brave speech or heroic decision in that moment. I just knew that if the roads clogged completely, I would be trapped in town with thousands of scared people competing for food, fuel, and safety. I also knew I had a better option than almost anyone else I knew. I went inside, pulled 2 duffel bags from the closet, and started packing for the cabin. The process took less than 40 minutes because I did not let myself think emotionally. Clothes, thermal base layers, wool socks, rain gear, work gloves, 2 pairs of insulated boots, toiletries, flashlights, batteries, water filter, first aid kit, tools, socket set, screwdrivers, hatchet, folding saw, duct tape, rope, spare spark plugs, a 12-volt air compressor, tire repair kit, ammunition, gun cleaning kit, maps, my paper road atlas, charger cables, my laptop, though I was not sure it would matter, my mother's old framed photograph, which I almost left behind and then did not. I filled every fuel container I owned. The truck was a 2011 Chevrolet Silverado, 4-wheel drive, extended cab, with a 5.3-liter V8 gasoline engine and all-terrain tires that still had decent tread. Nothing exotic, just reliable. I topped off the tank, checked fluids, checked belts, checked the spare tire pressure, loaded the bed with supplies under a canvas cover, and strapped everything down. I transferred food from plastic grocery bags into hard-sided totes because mice, weather, and vibration punish laziness. I brought 2 axes, a splitting maul, a pry bar, and my steel chainsaw with spare mixed fuel. Those are ordinary cabin tools in northern Minnesota. Anybody who tells you survival is all about weapons has either never lived remotely or never had to cut frozen wood in real weather. At 8:30, I drove to the gas station 2 blocks away to top off once more. Half the pumps were empty because people had parked and gone inside, or maybe gone nowhere. The line at the register ran almost to the drink coolers. There were arguments already. Raised voices, a woman crying because the card readers had frozen twice and she was trying to buy formula and medicine. Someone on the far side of the lot shouted that Route 2 was backed up for miles westbound. Another person yelled back that Highway 71 South had wrecks on both shoulders. Then everybody looked toward the road at once. A man in a torn, white medical gown was walking down the center turn lane barefoot, covered in dirt, eyes unfocused, one arm hanging at a bad angle. Cars tried to go around him. He changed direction unpredictably, lurching toward motion. A pickup clipped him with the mirror, and instead of falling properly, he spun, hit one knee, got back up, and grabbed at the bed rail as the truck accelerated away. That got the whole lot moving. Doors slammed, engines revved. People stopped pretending this was a rumor. I left before the argument about that man could turn into something worse. Getting out of Bemidji took an hour and 20 minutes for a drive that normally took 15. I stayed off the main southbound routes and worked northeast using county roads, farm connectors, and one badly maintained stretch of gravel I knew from deer season. I passed abandoned shopping carts in a ditch outside a grocery store. I passed a school bus stopped crooked at an intersection with the driver's door open and no driver in sight. I passed one state patrol cruiser angled across a frontage road, empty, lights still flashing, battery slowly dying. The world was not ruined yet, but it was losing coordination at a frightening speed. I called my mother twice on the way. The first call connected and dropped. The second went through. She told me there were people banging on apartment doors in her building, asking for water, food, phones, anything. The police had come once and then left. She had pushed a dresser against her front door. I told her where I was going. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said I should have come to Brainerd. I can't help you from a 4th-floor apartment, I told her. Out there, I can stay ahead of this. I hated the truth of that sentence, even while I believed it. She asked if I thought it would reach the whole state. I said yes. That was the last clear conversation I ever had with her. Cell service started cutting out north of Blackduck. The bars on my phone went from weak to none and stayed there. By then, the roads had emptied some, not because the danger had passed, but because most people around that part of the county had either already committed to leaving or had decided to stay put and hide. I turned off the county road onto the old logging trail just after 11 in the morning. Branches scraped the truck. Mud sucked at the tires in the low spots. Twice I had to stop, get out, and clear deadfall by hand because I did not want to waste time sawing unless I had to. The cabin appeared the way it always had, sudden and plain among the trees. Brown walls, green metal roof, small front porch, one door, 2 front windows with shutters Wayne made from rough-cut pine. To the left sat the old steel fire ring and a weathered chopping block. To the right was a shed leaning just enough to make you keep an eye on it. Behind the cabin, the hand pump well stood over a shallow concrete pad with iron staining down one side. 50 yards farther back was a game trail winding toward lower ground. The place was silent. I got out with the pistol on my belt and the shotgun in hand, because silence is not the same thing as safety. The air smelled like damp pine, mud, and cold metal. No voices, no engine noise, no birds for a few seconds, then one chickadee somewhere above me, then another. I checked the porch, no sign of forced entry. I found the key in the tobacco tin, opened the door, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust, old wood smoke, mouse droppings, and dry pine boards. Familiar. There was a narrow bunk on each side wall, a table under the front window, 2 shelves, one old propane refrigerator, a counter, and the black cast-iron wood stove on a pad of cement board near the back corner. Nothing had changed since deer season except a mouse had gotten into a bag of paper towels. I locked the door behind me and stood still in the middle of the room with one hand on the shotgun. No cheering, no relief, just the understanding that I had reached the beginning of the real problem. The first day was labor. That is another thing people get wrong. A remote shelter is not safety until you spend energy turning it into safety. I unloaded the truck quickly but methodically. Food inside, ammunition dry and off the floor. Fuel stored away from the stove. Water containers by the counter. Tools sorted. Medical supplies accessible. Weapons cleaned, checked, and placed where I could reach them without tripping over them in the dark. I opened the shutters and cleaned the glass so I could see out clearly. I walked the perimeter 3 times. The cabin had decent sight lines to the trail approach, but poor visibility on the east side, where brush and young birch had grown in too thick. I cut some of that back with loppers and a folding saw until I could see 30 or 40 yards instead of 10. Then I checked the infrastructure. The propane system still had enough pressure to feed the refrigerator and the small 2-burner cooktop, but not enough that I trusted it long term. I shut it off for the time being and planned to rely mostly on the wood stove and conserved fuel. The well pump worked. The water came up clear after 10 hard strokes, then 20 more. I filled 2 stock pots and let them sit to settle while I checked for sediment. The generator in the shed, an old portable Honda with a pull start, fired on the 3rd pull after I changed the plug and drained the stale fuel from the carburetor bowl. It ran rough for a minute, then steadied. That meant I had backup electricity for battery charging and freezer use if I kept it rationed. More important, the solar trickle setup Wayne had rigged years earlier for lights had not completely died. The battery was weak but recoverable. I worked until sunset because fear is easier to manage when your hands are occupied. That first night, I did not light anything more visible than the dim interior lantern and the small fire in the stove. I covered the windows after dark except for a narrow gap at one front corner. I ate rice and canned chicken in silence and listened to the woods. Wind. A branch tapping somewhere. Once, far off, something that might have been a distant engine or might have been my imagination. I cleaned the shotgun again because it gave me something to do. At 9:30, I tried my phone. No signal. At 10, nothing. At midnight, nothing. At 1:15 in the morning, I heard my first human scream since reaching the cabin. It came from the direction of the logging trail. Male voice. Far enough away that I could not make out words. Just one scream, sharp and cut short. Then silence. Then after maybe 20 seconds, a second sound, not a scream this time. More like a strained yell from someone running out of breath. I moved to the front window, carefully lifted the edge of the blanket I had hung there, and watched the black line of the trail through a slice of moonlit trees. Nothing came into view. I stayed awake until dawn with the shotgun across my knees. Morning showed me nothing except a fresh set of tire tracks on the outer part of the trail approach where somebody had come in fast, hesitated, then backed out hard enough to dig ruts. They had not reached the cabin clearing. That was good. It also meant I was not as alone as I wanted to be. Over the next 4 days, the pattern of the collapse became visible from a distance, not through news, not through the internet, through movement and sound. People were fleeing, but without direction. Some vehicles passed on the county road in bursts, then none for hours. A column of dark smoke rose one afternoon from somewhere southwest, probably a structure fire. Gunshots carried once around dusk from very far off, then never again that night. Twice I saw helicopters at altitude, not low search flights, just machines moving from one point to another, heading south or west. By day 5, even that stopped. No authority came. No organized rescue rolled through rural Minnesota. No convoy reached my trail with instructions and blankets and a plan. It turned out the world was too busy collapsing in larger population centers to spend much attention on one cabin in the woods. My routine settled because routine is what keeps panic from becoming stupidity. Up at first light. Check the perimeter. Pump water. Boil a day's worth. Eat. Split wood. Inspect doors, windows, and roofline. Scan the trail. Listen. Charge batteries if fuel use allowed it. Work on long-term improvements before noon while I had the most energy. Rest a little in the afternoon. Hunt or trap only when the risk made sense. Be inside and quiet before full dark. I improved the cabin in small, practical ways. I reinforced the inside door frame with longer screws driven into the studs. I cut a thick timber brace that could drop into 2 steel brackets across the door at night. I added wire mesh inside the crawlspace vents so nothing small could move in and nest where I could not see it. I stacked split firewood in 2 separate locations so one wet pile would not ruin all of it. I relocated supplies away from the front wall in case a window ever failed. I rigged simple noisemakers on the trail using monofilament fishing line and empty metal food cans with a few bolts dropped inside. Not traps, just alerts. I marked distances from the front porch to key trees with small notches on a board inside the cabin, so if I ever had to judge range under stress, I would not be guessing. That may sound calculated now, but at the time it was just work. Small problems I could solve while larger ones remained impossible. On day 6, I found the first walker near the cabin. I had stopped calling them sick people by then, because the label no longer matched the behavior. The thing I saw moving between the birch trunks east of the clearing was once a woman, probably in her 20s or 30s, wearing one running shoe, one bare foot. Black leggings, torn at one knee, and a gray zip hoodie stained with mud. Her hair was tangled across her face. Her gait was wrong. Not movie wrong, not supernatural. Wrong in a way that suggested broken coordination and relentless intent. She was not wandering randomly. She was turning toward sound, toward motion, toward the cabin itself after hearing me split wood. The first clear look at one up close changed the problem from abstract to practical. It was real. It was here. It could reach me. I backed toward the porch without hurrying. She accelerated clumsily, shoulders forward, one arm extended. Her eyes were open but did not track normally. There was dried blood on the sleeve of her hoodie and on the side of her face, but I did not focus on that. I focused on distance, door, footing, and the fact that if I let her reach the porch, I might draw more with noise. I stepped inside, shut the door, and watched through the side gap as she reached the cabin wall and slapped both palms against the siding, then dragged them across it, then began stumbling along the front looking for entry. She had no caution, no curiosity, no human hesitation. Just persistence. That was worse than rage. Rage burns out. Persistence keeps going. I could have used the shotgun. I did not. Noise travels too far in still woods. Instead, I took Wayne's old framing hammer from the bench, waited by the hinge side of the door, unlatched it, and pulled it inward just enough that when she surged against it, her balance carried her into the opening. I hit her once hard behind the ear, then again at the base of the skull when she dropped to one knee. It was fast, ugly, and very close. I will not describe it more than that. What matters is that she stopped moving. I dragged the body 50 yards into a low area, covered it with brush temporarily, and spent the next hour cleaning the porch, my gloves, the hammer, and myself with boiled water and bleach solution. My hands shook only after the work was done. That was the moment I stopped waiting for things to return to normal. The cabin became my whole world after that. Food was the next major reality. I had packed enough for several weeks if rationed carefully, maybe longer if I accepted boredom and steady weight loss. The woods could supplement that, but anyone who thinks hunting is easy emergency food has watched too much television. Game gets scarce fast when people are desperate, and every shot announces your presence. So I used quiet methods first. Snares for rabbits in likely runs. A simple trot line and set lines at a small lake a mile and a half north that Wayne had always called Alder Pocket, really more of a widened pond connected to a chain of marshy water. Bluegill, perch, one small northern pike, enough protein to matter. I kept my trips irregular and my tracks brushed out as best I could because even in that early phase I was more worried about people than walkers. People remained the bigger danger because people could think, lie, watch, and decide I had something worth taking. I learned that on day 9. I heard an engine around noon, not on the county road. Close. Coming up the logging trail slowly, carefully, the way somebody drives when they do not know whether the path dead ends in mud or opens into useful property. I killed the stove draft, went silent, and moved to the side window where I had the better angle. A side-by-side utility vehicle rolled into view with 2 men in hunting jackets and knit caps, both armed. One had a scoped bolt-action rifle across his lap. The driver had a revolver on his hip. They were not panicked refugees. They were locals, or at least woodsmen, moving cautiously and looking for resources. When they saw the cabin, they stopped 50 yards out and shut the engine off. The passengers stood and called, "Anybody here?" I did not answer. He called again, more loudly. "Cabin owner, we're looking for fuel and radio batteries. We can trade." Still, I did not answer. That was a hard decision, because maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe they were decent men. Maybe they were exactly what they looked like. But I had no way to verify any of that, and opening a negotiation from a weak position with 2 armed strangers in a lawless county would have been foolish. The driver stepped out and walked a few paces forward, scanning the porch, the windows, the woodpile, The truck tracks I had tried to disguise but had not fully erased. He saw enough to know the cabin was occupied. He also saw enough to know I was not naive. "Listen," he said, voice carrying clearly. "If you're in there, you need to know people are getting hit bad in Blackduck and north of there. Folks are clearing out. No service, no sheriff response. We're heading for family farther west." He paused, maybe hoping I would respond. I did not. Then he said something that made my skin tighten. "There's another group moving around out here. 4 men, maybe 5. Took supplies off a place near Waskish. Broke into a fish camp and beat the owner. If you're staying, keep watch." That was either a warning or a lie meant to make me answer. I treated it as both. After another minute, they got back in the side-by-side and left. I watched until the sound faded. Then I packed the most critical supplies into tighter defensive positions, moved some fuel into a concealed pit under the shed floor, and spent the rest of the afternoon building a false sense of scarcity inside the cabin. I left only a modest stack of visible supplies from the windows. Nothing that screamed abundance. That night, for the first time, I slept in 2-hour stretches with alarms set on my watch. The next week passed in a cycle of tense, quiet, and hard work. I cut more wood than I thought I would need because northern nights turn cold quickly once weather shifts, and because dry fuel is stored security. I improved concealment around the truck by brushing in the rear approach and draping a weathered tarp over the most reflective surfaces when it was parked behind the shed. I drained and rotated gasoline between containers, so nothing sat too long. I tested the generator only briefly every few days to conserve fuel and keep the carburetor from gumming up. I made notes in a spiral pad about what I ate, how much water I used, what sounds I heard, what tracks I found. Small records help fight the feeling that time is turning to mud. Emotionally, the worst part was the not knowing. No messages from my mother, no state broadcasts, no weather radio updates except static and occasional clipped emergency tones without readable voice follow-up. Once I climbed the ridge west of the cabin and held my phone high like a fool, hoping for one bar of signal. Nothing. Another time, I drove 3 miles back toward the county road and stopped in a dip where I used to get occasional reception during deer season. Nothing there either. The network was gone or overloaded beyond use. Loneliness arrived slower than fear, but dug in deeper. A person can manage immediate danger because immediate danger gives you tasks. Loneliness gives you space to think. I started talking out loud while I worked just to hear a human voice. Simple things, step-by-step job talk. Need to clear that branch. Water's boiling. That hinge is loosening again. It was not madness. It was maintenance. Around day 14, the weather broke cold and wet. A gray front rolled in from the northwest with steady rain that lasted nearly 20 hours. The cabin roof rattled. The trail turned to soup. My woodpile cover leaked on one corner, and I had to restack half of it. The temperature dropped into the 30s overnight, cold enough that the mud skinned over by dawn. That weather bought me a short period of relative safety because neither walkers nor people moved efficiently through soaked brush and freezing muck. I used the time to recover physically and plan better. I also found a working radio. Wayne had kept an old handheld amateur radio set in a metal box with spare batteries, mostly because he liked gadgets and disliked relying on one system. I am not a licensed radio operator, but in a dead world rules become less important than utility. After cleaning corrosion from one battery contact and rigging a better improvised antenna wire from the porch awning support to a pine branch, I managed to pull in fragments on one weather band, and then, later, weak voice traffic on another frequency. Not official dispatch, not organized emergency management, just scattered human voices. I heard somebody in Thief River Falls asking if any medical staff were alive at Sanford Hospital. I heard someone near Duluth calling for fuel and antibiotics. I heard another man identifying himself only as Mason at Checkpoint 7, telling anyone listening that infected individuals were not stopping from standard torso wounds and advising head trauma or complete incapacitation. His voice was steady in a way that suggested he had been repeating the message for days. I wrote down every location, every call sign, every clue, even though most did not help me directly. The important thing was this: pockets of people were still alive, still transmitting, still trying. That gave me just enough hope to keep the next week from collapsing inward. Then the men came. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30, low sun through the trees, when the line of empty cans I had rigged on the trail rattled once, then again, then hard enough to tell me this was not wind. I was inside cleaning fish at the counter. I froze, set the knife down, and moved to the side window. 3 men, not 4 or 5, but enough. Walking, not driving. One with a camouflage backpack, one carrying a crowbar, one with a short pump shotgun held casually in both hands. They were not trying to be quiet anymore because they believed they had reached someone smaller and weaker than themselves. The man with the crowbar shouted first. "We know you're here." No answer from me. He shouted again. "We just need food and fuel. Open up and nobody gets hurt." That line told me all I needed. Anyone who says nobody gets hurt is already planning harm. I stayed low and moved to the back corner where I could see the front door through a crack beside the blanket. The shotgun I held was loaded, safety on, muzzle down. I was not thinking about glory. I was thinking about angles. The walls of that cabin were wood, not brick. If shooting started, cover was limited. My best advantage was that I knew the layout and they did not. The man with the backpack moved toward the window on the left. The one with the crowbar took the porch. The one with the shotgun stayed back near the woodpile, probably meant to cover the others. "Last chance," porch man yelled. Then he hit the door with the crowbar. The brace held. He hit it again, harder, and the whole frame shuddered but did not split. While he reset for a third strike, the man at the window smashed the glass with something in his hand and reached through to clear the remaining pieces. That was the first shot I fired. I aimed at the arm, not because I was noble, but because it was the only clear target that did not risk a miss through brush and reflection. The blast in that small cabin was deafening. The man screamed and disappeared from the window. Outside, everybody started shouting at once. The porch man backed off hard. The third man fired blindly into the wall twice from near the woodpile. Splinters kicked from the outer siding above the table. I moved immediately. Never stay where muzzle flash marked you. I dropped to the floor on the opposite side of the room, racked the shotgun, and waited. My ears rang so badly I could barely separate sounds. Then I heard what I needed. Not coordinated attack, but confusion. One of them yelled, "He hit Travis! He hit Travis!" Another shouted, "Go around back!" That was the worst possible move for them because the rear approach was brushy, narrow, and visible from the slit I had left in the back blanket for exactly that reason. When the man with the crowbar came into view between two young firs, half crouched and trying to move quickly, I fired through the open gap where I had already pushed the blanket aside. He dropped instantly and did not get up. The third man ran. I heard crashing through brush, then receding footfalls, then nothing. For several minutes I stayed prone, reloaded with shaking hands, and waited for either return fire or silence to break. Nothing came. When I finally moved, I did it slowly. I checked each window angle first, then the door, then the porch. The man by the broken window was alive, but no longer a threat. The man at the rear tree line was down and still. The third had vanished. This is where fiction usually turns the survivor into an action hero. Real life turns him into a tired mechanic with ringing ears, adrenaline nausea, and a new set of bad problems. Bodies attract walkers. Noise attracts walkers. Unfinished fights attract surviving friends. The cabin was compromised. My position was known. My best option was not to feel triumphant. My best option was to move fast. I dragged both bodies well away from the cabin, took only what was immediately useful without lingering, and then spent the remaining daylight repairing what I could. Broken window covered first with plywood from the shed, then insulated from the inside with a folded wool blanket. Door frame checked. Wall impacts assessed. No penetration into critical supplies. I found one spent shell from their shotgun outside, but not the weapon itself. The runner had taken it or thrown it into brush. From the packs I recovered canned food, pain medicine, a lighter, 2 boxes of .22 ammunition, jerky, and a paper map with 3 places circled in blue pen, a fish camp, an abandoned service station, and a private hunting lease west of my position. They had been working the area systematically. After dark, I did not sleep at all. The next morning proved what I already feared. The gunfire had drawn walkers, not a horde. I never saw one of those movie-sized masses in the woods. Dense forest and scattered settlement do not move that way. What comes instead is a drip feed of danger. Individuals and pairs, sometimes 3, following sound or scent or movement until they bump into something living. By noon, I had counted 7 moving through the tree line at various distances, none with any idea of stealth, all with that same relentless, unbalanced drive. I dealt with 2 quietly using the hammer again when they reached the porch blind side. The others drifted past or got stuck in brush to the east and eventually lost direct orientation on the cabin. That day changed my strategy. Until then, I had been surviving at the cabin. After the raid, I started preparing to leave it if needed. I cached supplies. This was not dramatic bunker engineering, just practical redundancy. A sealed tote buried under slash and leaf litter near the ridge, food, water filter, ammunition, fire starter, socks, knife, painkillers, map copy. Another smaller cache near Alder Pocket under an overturned aluminum boat Wayne and his friends had abandoned years ago. Line, hooks, energy bars, purification tablets, emergency blanket. If someone took the cabin or fire destroyed it, I did not want to become helpless in one afternoon. I also prepared the truck for fast departure. Backed in, nose out, fuel topped, recovery chain stowed, front seat cleared. Keys always on my belt, never on the table. These are small habits, but small habits are what determine whether you leave in 1 minute or 10, and in bad conditions 10 minutes is a luxury. Days blurred. Weather turned clearer. Leaves began to shift. The forest went from summer fullness toward the brittle edge of fall. At dawn, frost silvered the grass around the well. I lost weight. My beard grew out. My hands cracked from cold water and bleach. I stopped checking the phone every hour, then every day, then almost at all. I talked to Wayne in my head sometimes, because he had been dead 6 years and because he would have understood the cabin better than anyone. I imagined him complaining about how I stacked kindling, or how carelessly I left an axe leaning against the block. It helped more than I cared to admit. The radio brought fragments of a wider picture. Military roadblocks had failed in some places and held in others. Hospitals were mostly gone as functioning systems. Some counties had organized local defense groups. Others had burned through their fuel and manpower in the first week. A voice from Fargo claimed a treatment center existed in North Dakota, but nobody confirmed it. Another voice from central Wisconsin said infected numbers dropped in severe cold because movement slowed, though it did not stop them completely. That mattered. Winter was coming. In northern Minnesota, winter is not scenery. Winter is a force multiplier. It kills the unprepared. It also narrows movement corridors and freezes wetlands into roads. I began planning for a cold season siege. Insulation first. I stuffed gaps in the window frames with backer rod and rags, hung thicker blankets, built a secondary inner door using scavenged plywood and hinges from the shed, creating a small cold trap entry space. Cut enough split wood to last deep into December if used carefully, maybe farther if weather stayed average. I inventoried every calorie. Rice and beans became less of an emergency reserve and more of the baseline. Fish and occasional squirrel or rabbit made the difference between weakness and function. Then, against all probability, I heard my mother on the radio. It was not a direct conversation. It was a relay, weak and damaged by static. A woman identifying herself as Karen in Brainerd, trying to reach Caleb Mercer in Bemidji or Blackduck area if anyone hears this. My name, spoken across a dead landscape in a voice not hers. Someone else must have transmitted on her behalf or repeated her message. The signal faded before more came through. I answered until my throat hurt. Nothing came back. But she was alive then, or had been recently enough for someone to repeat her words. That one moment carried me through another 2 weeks. I started climbing the ridge daily at the same hour with the radio, transmitting a short message, my name, my location in general terms, that I was alive and holding, that I would listen for 5 minutes past the hour. Most days I got nothing. Once I got another station bleeding over mine. Once I got weather chatter. Once I thought I heard Brainerd Tower Group, and then static swallowed it. Still, a schedule is something, a thread. The hardest night came in early October. Rain had frozen to sleet after dark, coating branches and the roof. Around 11, the cans on the trail rattled violently. I was awake instantly, lantern low, shotgun ready. Then came another sound from outside the front wall, not walking, not scratching, but weight leaning heavily and sliding. I peered through the gap and saw 3 walkers pressed near the porch, drawn perhaps by the stove's faint heat or my earlier movement at the ridge. One of them wore part of a sheriff's winter jacket. Another was so mud-covered I could barely tell age or sex. The third stood still for several seconds, head tilted, then slammed forward against the porch post hard enough to shake a sleet loose from the roof edge. More shapes moved behind them. Not dozens, maybe 8, maybe 10. In thick woods at night, numbers are hard, but it was more than I could safely manage up close without noise, and if they piled against the porch or broke the patched window under repeated impact, the cabin would become a coffin. That was when all the earlier preparation mattered. I moved to the back, opened the secondary route I'd cut through brush over the past weeks, and slipped out carrying only the essentials already staged: backpack, rifle, pistol, headlamp off, keys, radio, 2 water bottles, 1 food bag, blanket roll. I did not try to save everything. I did not make a last stand over canned soup and old tools. I left. Cold rain hit my face immediately. I looped wide east through the birch and alder, staying low, boots sinking in black mud under the forming crust. Twice I stopped dead when I heard movement nearby, but both times it was branches unloading sleet. I reached the truck, which I had already concealed 50 yards from its usual spot for exactly this reason, started it without headlights, and rolled downhill in 4-wheel drive until I was far enough from the cabin clearing to turn on dim running lights only. In the mirror, through trees and sleet, I saw nothing of the cabin except darkness. I drove north first, not south, because south was obvious and because the ground north had more cover and 2 possible loops back toward Alder Pocket. I parked under dense spruce near the water, shut everything down, and waited until morning, wrapped in a blanket with the rifle across my lap and the windows cracked a finger width against condensation. At dawn, I hiked back on foot to observe. The cabin still stood. The porch rail was damaged. The plywood over the broken window had been knocked partly loose. 2 walkers milled nearby. 3 more were down along the trail where they must have stumbled, slipped, or tangled in the line alarms. Nothing like a full overrun, but enough to prove the site had become a beacon once too often. I spent the next 2 days clearing it again and repairing what I could, but something in my thinking had changed. The cabin was no longer the unchallenged center of survival. It was one node in a shrinking network of options. That is an important distinction. Once you accept that no position is permanent, you think better. By mid-October, the first sustained cold locked the ground at night. The infected slowed in visible ways when temperatures dropped hard. Their motion grew stiffer by morning. Not safe, just reduced. Human movement changed too, less wandering, more calculated. Smoke from distant chimneys appeared on still mornings, telling me some people had made it through the first phase and settled into winter shelters of their own. Then I finally made contact. It was on the ridge at 1 in the afternoon, sky clear and windless, radio battery warm inside my jacket so the cold would not kill it too fast. I gave my usual transmission. Name, general location, alive. Listening. For 10 seconds, nothing. Then a burst of static and a woman's voice, older, strained. "Caleb, this is not Karen. This is Ruth at First Lutheran in Brainerd. Your mother was here. She left with county volunteers 3 days ago, moving south to a stronger site near Little Falls. She left your name and said if anybody heard you, tell you she was alive." I sat down in the frozen leaves so fast I almost dropped the radio. I asked for details. Got few, limited battery, limited time. Ruth said a church network and former county emergency people had organized a convoy. Limited seats. Medical cases prioritized. My mother had gone with them because the Brainerd building was no longer secure. She had been scared, but walking, talking, and determined. Ruth repeated that twice, as if she knew repetition is what makes hope feel real. Then the battery on her end must have died, because the signal vanished. I cannot describe the relief without making it sound bigger than the world I was living in, but it was. Not pure relief, because now there was a destination, and that created pressure. Little Falls was a long way from my cabin through uncertain roads, and worse uncertainty beyond them. But my mother was alive. That turned survival from a static problem into a directional one. I spent 3 days preparing to move. I did not abandon the cabin entirely. I winterized what I could, sealed stores, hid tools, and left caches in place because I had learned enough not to trust any single plan. Then I built the truck for the longest drive of my life. Fuel in every container. Food portioned, water secured, tire chains accessible, rifle and shotgun cleaned, loaded and stowed safely but reachable, cold weather clothing layered for road breakdowns, maps marked with primary and secondary routes avoiding major highways where possible. I chose county roads, logging roads, frontage roads, and farm connectors. Slower, but less likely to be jammed or controlled by desperate groups. The morning I left, frost rimed the cabin roof white. I stood on the porch with my pack on and looked at the place that had kept me alive for nearly 7 weeks. The siding still bore the scrape marks from that first walker. The repaired window looked ugly. The woodpile was neat because I had kept it neat even when nobody would see it. In another life, I might have closed the door and promised to return in deer season. Instead, I locked it, slid the key back into the tobacco tin, and drove away. The road south was a study in the remains of hurried decisions. Abandoned cars with empty fuel cans beside them. A burned-out camper near a rest pull-off. One state snowplow truck parked across a part of a rural junction with nobody around it. A farmhouse flying a white bedsheet from the porch rail. Message unclear. Smoke from some homes, silence from others. I saw walkers only in 1s and 2s, mostly in ditches, fields, or standing along tree lines as if waiting for instructions that would never come. Cold had not killed them, but it had slowed the world enough that careless movement was rarer. Twice I detoured around signs of organized human presence because I could not tell whether I would be welcomed or stripped. Once near Akeley, I watched through binoculars from a tree line as 6 armed people stopped vehicles at a fuel station and inspected cargo. They had a system, but not enough structure to trust. I went around. Near Motley, I hit my first real blockage. A pileup at a narrow bridge approach, cars nose to tail with doors open and frost inside the windows. I backed out a 1/4 mile, cut through a maintenance gate, and followed a snowmobile service track that paralleled a drainage ditch until it rejoined a township road on the far side. Without years of driving rural Minnesota for work, I would never have found that route. Familiarity saved me again. On the second night, I slept in the truck behind an abandoned feed store. Engine off, coat zipped to my chin, pistol under my hand, and boots still on. Every sound woke me. In the distance, once, I heard a woman shouting for someone named Eli. Then a single shot. Then nothing. I did not go toward it. That is the kind of choice that stains a person, but survival is full of them. I reached the outskirts of Little Falls late the next afternoon and almost turned back because the place looked like every broken community I had tried to avoid. Barricades at one road entrance, burned vehicles at another, sandbags near a former county building. But then I saw a hand-painted sign nailed to plywood. Checkpoint. Survivors report here. No sudden moves. Beneath it stood 2 adults in layered winter clothes with orange hunter caps and rifles slung muzzle down, not waving them around like bandits. That posture mattered. I stopped 50 yards out, rolled the window down halfway, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, and said my name before they asked. One of them, A woman, maybe in her 50s, with a paramedic patch sewn onto an old coat sleeve, stepped forward and asked where I came from, whether I had been bitten or exposed to bodily fluids, whether I was alone, and whether I had any symptoms. Her questions were efficient, not cruel. Somebody behind her had learned enough to build procedure from disaster. When I told her my mother's name, Karen Mercer, and said I had heard she was brought south from Brainerd, the expression on her face changed from caution to recognition. "She's here," the woman said. "In the school gym annex. She helps in the kitchen now." There are moments when a person's body decides before the mind catches up. My hands started shaking so badly on the wheel, I had to grip it harder just to keep them still. I found my mother on a folding chair near a stack of boxed canned goods, wearing 2 sweaters and my old high school baseball jacket I had not seen in 15 years. She looked smaller, older in a way that it happened in weeks instead of years. But when she stood up and saw me, she was still my mother, alive, furious that I had come, relieved that I had come, both at once. She hugged me hard enough to hurt and then hit my shoulder and told me I was an idiot for taking so long. I laughed for the first time since Bemidji. We talked for hours that night. Her building in Brainerd had failed after food ran low and more residents got sick. A church group had pulled together a convoy with county volunteers, 1 retired sheriff's deputy, 2 nurses, and whoever still had trucks that ran. They moved people in stages, house to church, church to rural school, school farther south. It was not neat, it was not safe. It was just enough organization to keep some people alive. The Little Falls site was not paradise. It was a fortified school complex with maybe 120 survivors, strict rationing, armed perimeter watches, too few antibiotics, and too many tired people. But it was a system, a real one. Water purification, wood heat backup, medical isolation rooms, radio schedules, work rosters, rules. After living alone in a hunting cabin where every sound after dark could mean the end, rules sounded beautiful. I did not tell everyone everything about the cabin. Some details stay private because private resources remain valuable in unstable times. But I told them enough to be useful. Road conditions north, fuel access points, observed threats, what cold seemed to do to walker movement, how scattered groups were behaving in the woods. Real information, practical information. That was the first thing I had to trade besides labor. They put me on vehicle maintenance the second day. Of course they did. A diesel mechanic in a failing world is as employable as a clean water source. I serviced generators, changed oil, patched radiator hoses, rewired a failing battery bank, and taught 3 teenagers how to inspect belts, filters, and tire wear before breakdowns became disasters. At night, I slept indoors with 30 other people nearby, and still woke at every creak, hand searching for a shotgun that was no longer resting beside a cabin bunk. Habits do not disappear because walls get stronger. Sometimes I still think about that cabin, about the first cold morning there, the smell of split birch, the sound of the hand pump, the fear sitting in my chest while I stacked food on shelves and pretended organization was the same thing as safety. That place kept me alive long enough to find my mother again. It gave me structure when structure everywhere else had failed. It taught me that survival is less about bravery than about preparation, routine, and accepting ugly choices without wasting time pretending they are noble. People ask, when they hear parts of the story now, whether I was scared being out there alone. Yes. every day. I was scared when I drove out of Bemidji, not knowing if the roads would close behind me. I was scared the first time I heard a scream on the trail at night. I was scared when the woman in the gray hoodie found the porch. I was scared when 3 armed men tried to force the door. I was scared when I slipped out the back in freezing sleet because the front of the cabin had become a noise magnet for the dead. I was scared driving south with no certainty except a weak radio message and my own stubbornness. Fear did not go away. It just got sorted into useful and useless forms. Useful fear made me brace the door, bury caches, move quietly, and leave when staying became pride instead of reason. Useless fear was everything else. If there is one truth I learned in those weeks, it is that survival does not look dramatic from the inside. It looks repetitive. It looks like boiling water, drying socks, counting shells, checking hinges, studying maps, and forcing yourself to eat when you are too tense to feel hungry. It looks like fixing what you can reach and ignoring what you cannot change yet. It looks like deciding over and over not to panic just because the world has earned your panic.